Hello, and welcome to my channel, Boring History Nights. Tonight, we're stepping inside the towering walls of medieval castles, the places we often imagine as safe havens of kings and queens, filled with knights in shining armor, roaring feasts, and royal luxury. Castles were supposed to be symbols of safety, strength, and power. They were the ultimate fortresses of the Middle Ages, built to withstand armies, protect noble families, and dominate the landscape for miles around. But what if I told you that living inside one of these castles was often far more dangerous than living outside its walls? What if I told you that these mighty fortresses, these marvels of medieval engineering, were actually death traps waiting to happen? Because behind the grand banquet halls and stone battlements was a world of freezing cold rooms, poisoned air, disease-filled moats, contaminated water, and choking smoke. The thick walls might keep out enemies' swords, but they also trapped in filth, hunger, and fear. People didn't just fear invaders from the outside. They feared the very place they call home. You see, medieval castles had secrets, dark ones. During winter, their enormous stone walls turned them into ice-cold prisons where fires barely kept the cold at bay. Sanitation was so poor that waste seeped into water supplies, spreading deadly diseases that could wipe out entire households in days. And when enemies surrounded the castle in a siege, life inside became a nightmare. Food ran out, water grew foul, people starved, fell sick, or burned alive in accidental fires as they huddled together for warmth and safety. And that's before we even talk about the rats. We often picture castles as safe havens, standing proudly against the chaos of the medieval world. But for the people living inside, servants, soldiers, even kings and queens, these mighty fortresses were far from safe. They were places where daily life balanced on the edge of disaster. So tonight, as the world grows quiet and the shadows deepen, we're going to uncover the chilling truth about these medieval strongholds. Why were they built this way? Why did they become so dangerous to the very people they were meant to protect? And why, despite all the risks, did entire generations continue to live and die inside these stone giants? Stay with me as we peel back the layers of history and step into a world where castles weren't just fortresses, they were death traps in disguise. Because once you learn the truth, you'll never look at those romantic castle ruins on postcards the same way again. Tonight, we step beyond the drawbridges of time and into the shadowed heart of the medieval world. A world where castles rose like giants across the hills, where stone walls stood like guardians of power and might, and where kings, queens, lords, and ladies all claimed sanctuary behind battlements and towers that pierced the cold gray skies of Europe. To the medieval eye, these castles were symbols of strength. They were built to withstand armies, rebellions, and sieges. They were designed to protect life itself. But what the songs and poems never told you, what the paintings and golden frames forgot to show, was the other story, the one whispered in the shadows. The story that living inside these mighty fortresses was far from a dream of comfort and glory. In reality, it was often a slow, grinding struggle for survival, because behind those walls where banners waved proudly in the wind, life was cold, dark, damp, and sometimes deadly. Tonight, we begin with the greatest irony of all, the illusion of safety. Imagine this. It's the year 1250. You approach a castle for the first time. Perhaps you are a wandering trader, carrying wool and salt to sell in the market. Perhaps you are a farmer seeking shelter after bandits burned your village. Or perhaps you are a messenger of the king, riding hard to the misty hills to deliver news of war. From miles away, you see it, rising from the rocky cliffs like a mountain of stone. Its towers are crowned with fluttering flags. Its walls glint pale gray beneath the watery sun. Around its base lies a moat, dark and still, its waters reflecting the jagged outline of battlements and arrow slits. To the weary traveler, it seems magnificent, impenetrable, safe. You picture roaring fires inside, halls lit by golden candlelight, the warmth of food, drink, and shelter waiting just beyond those gates. But as you ride closer, the truth begins to unfold. The air grows colder here. The walls, so grand from afar, cast deep shadows over the narrow road leading to the drawbridge. Torches sputter in iron brackets, their smoke trailing upward into the gray sky. The wind whips through the open gates, carry with a faint scent of damp stone, and something else, something you can't quite name. It smells unpleasant. A mix of smoke, sweat, and something sour, like rot carried on the breeze. You cross the drawbridge. It groans under the weight of your horse. Below, the black water laps at the wooden supports. For a moment, you picture falling, slipping through the gaps and planks, the cold water closing over your head, the weight of armor or saddlebags dragging you down. You look forward quickly and urge the horse on. Inside the gates, the sound changes. Outside, the wind had howled across the hills. But here, in the narrow courtyard, the air seems trapped. Smoke from the smithy mingles with the smell of horses from the stables. Chickens scatter underfoot. Pigs root in the mud near a pile of refuse dumped from some upper window. It is not the clean, orderly world the songs promised. And as you look around, you notice something else. The people here do not look particularly safe. Servants hurry about with pale, tired faces, hauling buckets of water from the well, carrying firewood up steep staircases, chasing after half-wild dogs that dart between the carts and barrels. Soldiers lean against the walls, armor dented and dull, coffee into their hands as they warm themselves by a small fire. A woman shakes a rug from an upper window, releasing a cloud of dust into the chilly air. Life inside the castle seems harsh, cramped, restless, and you've only been here for 5 minutes. This was a reality of medieval castles. They were never the quiet, safe havens we imagine today when we walk through their empty ruins or see them in movies glowing beneath the sunset. For the people who lived here, hundreds of them in some castles, life was noisy, cold, and dangerous in ways modern visitors rarely realize. Those towering walls that keep out invaders, yes. But they also kept in smoke, disease, smells, and fear. They shut out the sun, so that courtyards stayed damp and muddy for weeks after rain. They turned winter winds into icy drafts that whistled through every crack and corridor. At night, the great wooden gates were bolted shut with iron bars thick as a man's arm. No one came in or out. Safety, the lords believed, meant closing the world away behind stone and steel. But inside, danger wore many faces. A single spark from a torch could set straw and timber ablaze before anyone could stop it. A single illness carried by a traveler or a rat could spread through the crowded halls like wildfire. A single siege could trap hundreds of men, women, and children inside with dwindling food and foul water until desperation drove them to the edge of madness. The castle was supposed to be a shield against the dangers of the world. But the truth whispered through the corridors was different. Sometimes, the danger lived here too. Walk deeper now. Follow the narrow passage toward the great hall, where banners hang from the rafters and a fire burns in the massive hearth. This is the heart of the castle, the place where the Lord holds court, where guests dine on long wooden tables, where minstrels sing of valor and love. It should feel warm here, safe, alive, and yet look closer. The fire does not reach the edges of the hall. In the corners, the shadows gather like cobwebs. Smoke from the hearth hangs in the air, stinging your eyes, making you cough. The rushes on the floor, scattered reeds meant to keep the mud at bay, are damp, trodden by boots, hiding crumbs of food, and the bones tossed from the tables. Rats will come for them later. The Lord sits at the high table. His tunic is fine wool lined with fur. A gold chain glints at his throat. But even he shifts uncomfortably, pulling the cloak tighter around his shoulders as the winter wind seeps through cracks and shutters. Servants hurry with trenchers of bread and slabs of meat. The smell of roasting pork fills the air, but so does the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, the wet dogs lying near the fire, the refuse in the kitchens carried out to the moat. You realize slowly that the castle was not built for comfort, not for warmth, not even, truly, for health. It was built for power, for survival. And survival in the Middle Ages was often a brutal, miserable thing. This was the great illusion of safety. To the peasant in the village below, the castle on the hill looked like paradise compared to his thatched hut in the mud. To the traveler on the road, it promised shelter from wolves and bandits and storms. But step through its gates, and you found a world where winter froze the water in your cup, where smoke blackened the walls, where disease crept to the corridors, where fire and famine waited in silence for their moment to strike. The walls kept enemies out, yes, but they also kept you in. And sometimes that was the greater danger, because when sickness came, there was nowhere to run. When fire came, there was nowhere to escape. And when hunger came during a siege, when the gates were locked and the fields outside burned, the castle became a prison of stone, sealing its people inside with fear, filth, and death. So next time you walk through the ruins of a medieval castle on a bright summer day, when the grass is green and the walls are warm beneath the sun, remember this. The people who once lived here did not see romance in these walls. They saw cold. They saw darkness. They saw danger waiting in the shadows of their own fortress. For them, the castle was not just a home, not just a stronghold. It was a gamble with fate, a place where safety and peril lived side by side, divided only by stone, fire, and time. And often peril won. The snow began falling in the winter of 1315. At first, it was nothing unusual. Winter always came hard to the castles of Europe. Lords ordered extra firewood for the halls. Peasants drove in the last wagons of grain. Soldiers on the battlements wrapped themselves in thick cloaks against the wind. But this winter did not end. The snow turned to endless rain when spring came, drenching the fields, drowning the crops before they could ripen. Then came summer, wet, cold, and gray. Grain rotted in the ground. Hay for the animals grew thin. And inside castle walls across the continent, the storerooms began to empty before winter returned. It was the start of the Great Famine. For 3 years, from 1315 to 1317, Europe starved. Even castles, with their stockpiles and salted meat and guarded gates, could not escape it. The lords ate first, of course, the garrison second, servants and peasants last, picking through what scraps were left. Chronicles from the time speak in hushed voices about what happened when the bread was gone, when even the bark of trees was boiled into soup, when people looked at the bodies of dead and wondered. A castle kept you safe from raiders. It could not keep you safe from the sky itself. And then came the plague. The Black Death rolled across Europe in the 14th century like a tide of night. It did not care about walls or gates or titles. Kings died. Queens died. Priests, soldiers, servants, children. The disease took them all. Inside castles, people locked the gates and prayed the sickness would pass them by. It didn't. Rats ran along the rafters, through storerooms, across courtyards. Fleas leapt from their fur to the boots and blankets of the people who lived there. The first cough seemed small. The first fever, nothing unusual. But soon the black swellings rose on necks and armpits, and death followed within days. Some castles became tombs. Entire garrisons wiped out before the gates were ever open again. The wind carried only the stench of burning bodies from the pits where they were thrown. And still the walls stood, silent and cold, long after the people inside were gone. But a famine and plague crept slowly. Siege brought death with iron and fire. Take Kenilworth Castle in England, 1266. Rebel barons held the fortress against the king himself. Outside, royal troops cut off every road, every path, every chance of escape. Inside, the defenders rationed food. First bread, then horses, then dogs. Chronicles whisper that some ate things never meant for human mouths before it was over. When surrender came, the survivors stumbled out like ghosts, thin as corpses, eyes hollow from hunger. Or Harlech Castle in Wales, 1468. For 7 long years, the garrison held out against enemy forces. 7 years. Imagine the winters, the dwindling stores, the fear each time the sky darkened with storm clouds or the well water grew foul. They called it the siege of the starving men. The walls held, but at what cost to the souls inside them? And fire, always fire, waited for its chance. The great castle of Coucy in France burned in 1339 when English raiders set the town below a light. Flames leapt from roof to roof until even the stone towers glowed red in the night. People fled where they could, but some never reached the gates. At Hedingham Castle in England, a single spark in the kitchen set tapestries burning along the walls. Before the flames were out, half the hall was gone. Servants and soldiers alike fought the blaze with buckets drawn from the well. choking on the smoke as roofs crash down around them. Stone does not burn, but people do. Even the defenses themselves, sometimes killed. The moat surrounding many castles was not the clean, shining water you see in paintings. It was a ditch filled with rainwater, filth, the waste from latrines built to empty directly into it. During sieges, bodies sometimes floated there, thrown in by attackers or defenders alike. And yet soldiers drank from wells dug dangerously close to these poison moats. Chroniclers tell of dysentery sweeping through castle garrisons, leaving men too weak to hold swords or even stand at their posts. The enemy outside never lifted a finger. The defenders simply rotted from within. And still, people lived here. Children played in the courtyards where soldiers drilled. Women spun wool in chambers where the wind slipped through the shutters. Blacksmiths hammered in smoky forges, while priests muttered prayers in cold chapels smelling of incense and damp stone. Life went on, but always under shadow. A splinter infected a cut, and there were no doctors, only leeches and prayers. A chimney clogged with soot, and smoke filled the room before anyone could flee. A single enemy spy bribed a gatekeeper, and every soul inside might be dead by morning. Some betrayals became legend. In 1645, during the English Civil War, a man named Colonel Tinker Fox bribed his way into several royalist-held castles with promises of mercy. Once inside, his soldiers slaughtered the garrisons. The walls that promised safety became traps the moment trust was broken. Even peace brought danger. The castles were cold, damp. Smoke from the hearths clung to the rafters until lungs ached. Windows were slits against the wind, letting in little light. Candles smoked. Rushes on the floor hid fleas, and worse beneath their sweet-smelling herbs. Servants slipped on icy steps, carrying water from the well. Children fell from towers while chasing one another along parapets. Horses panicked in courtyards, trampling anyone too slow to move aside. And always, the cold crept in. Men woke with frost stiffening their beards. Ale froze in its casks. Bread hardened like stone. At night, families huddled together in the great hall, the fire painting their faces red and gold. But beyond that circle of light, the shadows never left. Perhaps the strangest death traps were the castles built on cliffs or crags for better defense. Take Dunatar Castle in Scotland, perched on a rocky headland above the North Sea. Storm winds slammed against its walls hard enough to tear roofs away. More than one traveler fell from a narrow path leading up to its gate, dashed on the rocks below before ever reaching safety. Or Montségur in France, clinging to a peak in the Pyrenees. When Crusaders finally took it in 1244, more than 200 defenders were burned alive at the foot of the mountain rather than renounce their faith. The walls protected them, until the very end, when they became the walls of their final prison. And yet, for centuries, castles ruled the landscape. Peasants looked up at their towers and saw power, protection, the promise of order in a violent world. They did not see the hunger in the winters when supplies ran out. They did not hear the coughing in the dark halls when plague crept in. They did not smell the smoke when fire raced along the rafters, or the stench of the moat in summer, or the fear when the enemy banners ringed the hills. From a distance, the walls looked strong, unshakable, eternal. Up close, they told another story. Today, the ruins stand silent. Grass grows where children once played in muddy courtyards. Birds nest in the arrow slits where archers once watched the woods for enemies. Tourists walk through empty halls, taking pictures where servants once hurried with buckets of water, with bread, with messages of surrender. The walls are still here. The people are gone. And maybe that is the final proof of all. The castles did not fall. They simply outlived everyone who thought they were safe inside. Step through the castle gates on a gray winter morning. The drawbridge creaks beneath your boots. The portcullis rattles above you like the bars of some vast iron cage. The air is damp and smells of smoke, of animals, of unwashed bodies. And you realize almost at once that this place, the grand castle you've heard so much about, is not the sanctuary you imagined. It is something else. Something far darker. The first thing you notice is the cold. Not the sharp, clean cold that feels outside, but a damp, heavy chill that seeps from the stone walls themselves. These towers and keeps were built for defense, not comfort. The walls are thick 6, 8, even 10 feet of solid rock meant to turn aside arrows and fire. Sunlight barely reaches through the narrow slits that pass for windows. The wind whistles through the cracks and shutters. Fires burn the great hall below, but their warmth never reaches the upper floors. Smoke curls along the rafters, leaving the air gritty, your throat raw. At night, even under layers of wool and fur, people shiver in their beds. Medieval chronicles mention winters when water froze inside the chambers of lords and ladies, when breath hung in white clouds above the high tables at dinner, when frost formed on the walls inside the chapels where priests mumbled mass with numb fingers. This was a castle. Grand, yes, but also a place where cold ruled half the year, and the people endured rather than lived. And with the cold came sickness. Today, we imagine castles as clean stone halls echoing with music and laughter. The reality smelled very different. The rushes covering the floors were rarely changed. Food scraps, animal dung, and the bones from yesterday's feast sank into the reeds underfoot until the air grew thick with rot. Fleas bred in the straw bedding. Rats scurried through cellars and kitchens. People spoke then of bad air, of curses, of God's anger when fever swept through the halls. But the truth was simpler. Castles were filthy. Latrines, called garderobes, emptied into cesspits or directly into the moat below. Servants carried water up endless stairs from wells often dug too close to those same moats, where waste and runoff seeped into the earth. Dysentery, typhoid, and worse followed. During the winter of 1422, chronicles from France describe entire households laid low by the flux, a polite term for the bloody diarrhea that killed as surely as any sword. Soldiers too weak to hold spears stumbled from the walls while enemies waited beyond bowshot, content to let disease do their work. The walls kept invaders out, but they kept sickness in. Then there was the smoke. Castles burned wood and peat in great halls, in kitchens, in private chambers where lords and ladies tried to keep warm. But chimneys were small, drafty, often clogged. The result was a haze that stung the eyes, choked the lungs, blackened the ceilings. Children grew up coughing. Servants worked with streaming eyes. Visitors left reeking of wood smoke, so thick it clung for days. Some medieval writers hinted that constant smoke contributed to the fevers, the aching chests, the slow deaths of men and women who lived their whole lives inside castle walls. But there was no escaping it, not if you wanted warmth. And warmth was precious, because death waited everywhere else. Falling was common in castles. Staircases spiraled tightly along the walls, steep and uneven, built that way so defenders could fight with swords in their right hands against attackers climbing upward. But for servants carrying water or firewood, one slip meant a plunge down stone steps with no rail to stop them. Chronicles mention women, even children, breaking necks on those stairs while hurrying about their duties. Courtyards bustled with horses, carts, and livestock driven in during sieges. People were trampled beneath hooves, crushed against walls when animals panicked at the clash of arms or the roar of fire in the kitchens. Even the wells proved deadly. Buckets slipped. Children leaned too far over the edge. More than one castle kept grim stories of servants or travelers drowned where the garrison drew its drinking water. The walls protected you from the outside world, but they wrapped you in danger their own. Fire remained the greatest terror. Stone walls could not burn, but everything inside them could: rafters, stairs, roofs, furniture, doors. Candles and torches lit the corridors day and night. Kitchens blazed with open hearths where whole oxen turned on spits. One careless moment, one torch too close to a hanging tapestry, one overturned candle in the solar, and the flames raced along rafters and rushes, trapping people behind doors swollen tight with heat. In 1216, at Rochester Castle in England, King John's men set fire to the tunnels beneath the tower where rebels held out. Chronicles say the fat of 40 slaughtered pigs was piled beneath the walls and cell light until stone cracked from the heat above the defenders' heads. At night, travelers saw the glow for miles. And when war came, the castle turned from home to prison overnight. Gates slammed shut. Villagers fled inside with whatever they could carry: grain, animals, children crying in the sudden dark. The enemy camped beyond bowshot, banners snapping the wind. At first, life inside continued. The Lord promised his people the walls would hold. The garrison stood watch. Priests prayed for deliverance. But the days stretched on. Food grew scarce. The enemy cut the roads, the streams, the fields. No one left. Nothing came in. In the winter siege of Harlech Castle in 1468, men boiled leather from horse harnesses for soup. At Kenilworth in 1266, survivors surrendered after eating rats, dogs, even the bodies of the dead, when nothing else remained. The walls that promised safety kept hunger locked inside with the defenders until surrender or death came for them all. Even peace brought no escape from danger. Servants hauling barrels of water slipped on icy steps, and broke bones no healer could set properly. Children chasing each other through corridors fell from parapets onto stones below. Blacksmiths went blind from sparks in smoky forges. Masons tumbled from scaffolds while repairing towers cracked by winter frost. A castle was a place of order, yes, but also of accidents waiting in silence, of lives snuffed out between the tolling of the chapel bell and the next call to supper in the great hall. And always the cold returned. Winter after winter. Chronicles speak of the freeze of 1234, when men lit fires in the very doorways of Durham Castle and still found the walls rimed with ice by morning, of the snows of 1315, when famine already stalked the land, and travelers found whole families in hilltop keeps frozen beside empty hearths when spring finally came. The lords dined on venison beside blazing fires. The servants shivered in the kitchens below, and beyond the walls, the wind screamed to the forest while wolves followed the roads waiting for whatever hunger left behind. Yet people kept building castles, because the world outside was worse. Bandits haunted the woods. Mercenaries from a dozen wars roamed the countryside when peace left them unemployed, burning villages, seizing food, taking whatever and whomever they pleased. The castle promised protection from that chaos, but also promised smoke, cold, disease, fire, hunger, accidents, and a long shadow of fear that never lifted from its courtyards or its freezing halls. A lord might ride out to hunt beneath bright winter skies. A lady might walk the walls in summer, when banners snapped in warm winds. Children might laugh in the courtyards on feast days when minstrels sang and wine flowed. But death lived here too. It waited in the stairs, the wells, the sickness and water, the spark in the rafters, the winter hunger, the enemy beyond the hills. Always waiting. That was life inside a medieval castle. Not the pageantry of films. Not the romance of painted tapestries or songs sung by firelight. But cold stone, thick smoke, bitter hunger, sudden accidents, creeping illness, and the knowledge that the same walls keeping the world out could become the walls of your tomb before the next full moon rose above the towers. And for many, they did. The wind still presses against the battlements tonight. It slides through the arrow slits like a whisper, rattles the shutters of the solar, where the lady of the castle lies awake, and sighs through the narrow stairways, spiraling into the depths below. In the great hall, the last fire burns low. Servants have drifted to uneasy sleep on pallets near the ashes, the warmth barely reaching them, a place of safety. The Lord had called it when he brought them all inside at the first sign of raiders in the hills. A fortress, a stronghold, but to those living behind its walls, it feels more like a trap with every passing day. The moat below stinks in the cold air. It is not the clean water painted in modern books, but a ditch filled with rain, mud, and worse. The refuse from the privies above, the waste of kitchens and stables, the runoff of storms carrying filth from the courtyards. Rats move along its edges, quick shadows in the moonlight. Their squeaks carry faintly upward to the walls where watchmen pace with torches, their breath rising white into the freezing air. It is easy to forget, centuries later, what these places smelled like. Smoke and tallow from the torches, sweat and animals from the courtyards, damp stone that never fully dried even in summer, mold growing in the corners of chambers where sunlight never reached, the stink of the moat drifting upward when the wind shifted the wrong way. Today, we walk through castle ruins under bright skies. We breathe clean air, hear only birdsong and the shuffle of tourist shoes on broken stone. But when these places were alive, the air was thick, heavy, clinging. People carried it in their clothes, in their hair, in their lungs. and in that air moved sickness. They did not know why disease came when it did. They blamed miasmas, curses, the stars, the will of God. But we know now what they could not. The rats in the cellars, the fleas in the bedding, the water drawn from wells too close to the latrines. Chronicles whisper fever burning through whole households inside castle walls while the enemy camped outside, never lifting a sword. The men on the battlements watched the banners in the distance by day, the campfires glowing on the hills by night, while inside their comrades coughed themselves to death in the smoky dark. There were castles where no battle was ever fought, no wall ever breached, but where death still walked the corridors in the shape of sickness. The Black Death proved it beyond all doubt. When plague came in 1347, people fled the town for castles on high ground, thinking the walls would save them. Lords shut the gates, keeping out beggars, travelers, merchants, anyone who might carry the pestilence. But the rats were already inside. They lived in the grain stores, the kitchens, the stables. Fleas leapt from their fur to the servants, to the soldiers, to the children sleeping on rushes spread over the cold stone floors. One by one, the cough began, the fever rose, the black swellings bloomed beneath the arms, at the neck, in the groin. Chronicles tell of castles where so many died so quickly that the survivors threw bodies into the moat because there was no time, no strength, no room for graves. The fires of burning corpses lit the night, while the enemy outside waited for silence from the walls. Sometimes they did not have to wait long, and even when disease spared them, the fire might not. People forget how flammable the Middle Ages were. We imagine castles as stone and iron, but inside those walls were wooden roofs, wooden stairs, wooden floors, tapestries hanging over every surface to keep out the draft, rushes covering the stones so feet would not freeze. The torches burned day and night. Candles smoked on every table. The kitchens roared with spits turning meat above open flames, while boys ran back and forth with dripping fat and steaming kettles. One overturned torch, one gust of wind to the wrong doorway, and the flames raced upward fast as thought. At Coucy Castle in France, fire took the great hall when servants carrying food to the high table spilled burning tallow along a passage lined with tapestries. At Hedingham in England, the wind carried sparks from the kitchens to the stables. The screams of trapped horses were heard across the fields. Stone walls kept out the enemy. They also kept in the fire until the roofs fell, and the people inside choked on the smoke before they ever reached the gate. But perhaps the most pitiless enemy was hunger. When the banners of siege appeared on the hills, the drawbridge came up, gates slammed shut. The people cheered at first, trusting their walls, their lord, their stores of grain and salted meat. But sieges did not end quickly. The enemy outside needed only to wait. Inside, the bread grew harder. The grain bins emptied. The ale turned sour. People slaughtered the livestock driven into the courtyards at the first alarm. Then the dogs. Then the rats. Chronicles speak of boiled leather, of weeds scraped from frozen fields beyond the walls when arrows were not watching, of mothers giving children water to fill their bellies because there was no food left. At Kenilworth in 1266, they held out for 6 long months before surrender, gaunt and hollow-eyed, too weak to bury the dead before opening the gates. At Harlech in 1468, they lasted 7 years. 7 years behind walls, turning colder and hungrier with each winter until they staggered out like walking corpses when the end finally came. The walls kept the enemy out. They kept the hunger in. And then there were the betrayals. Not every castle fell by storm. Some fell because a guard at the postern gate wanted silver more than loyalty, because a servant slipped the enemy through the sally port at night, because a starving soldier on the battlements believed the promises shouted from the dark beyond the moat. In the winter of 1645, during the English Civil War, more than one stronghold fell, because someone inside opened the way while the garrison slept. A fortress of stone was nothing when treachery walked the corridors in silence. Imagine waking to find enemy soldiers in the courtyard, the gates wide, the banners of your foes snapping above the towers where your own flew the night before. Imagine realizing that the walls you trusted have become your prison, your trap, your grave. Even in peace, the dangers never left. Children tumbled from parapets chasing each other along walls with no railings. Servants slipped on icy steps, carrying buckets from the well. Horses panicked in narrow courtyards, crushing those too slow to move aside. Accidents carried people off as surely as any army. The chronicles speak of a lady of high birth falling from a tower window at Windsor, of a boy drowned in the well at Dover while drawing water for the kitchens, of a mason rebuilding part Conway Castle who slipped from the scaffolding and vanished into the bailey below before men around him even cried out. The walls stood for centuries. The people within them did not, yet life went on. Priests still rang the chapel bells. Minstrels still sang on feast days when the Lord ordered wine from the cellars and venison from the hunts brought steaming to the high table. Children were still born in chambers above the courtyards where soldiers drilled in the dust of summer or the mud of spring rains. But death lived here too, in the water, in the smoke, in the fire waiting for one spark, in the slow hunger behind barred gates, in the silence of disease creeping through the rushes at night, and always in the shadows of the walls themselves, too high, too strong, too cold to let you forget that safety came at a price. And sometimes the price was everything. The walls protected, the walls trapped, the walls endured, the people endured less. If the cold didn't get you, the filth might. People today visit castle ruins and see the stone walls, the high towers, the sweeping views from the battlements, and they imagine romance. They picture knights in shining armor, noble ladies in gowns, the warmth of roaring fires, the music of lutes drifting through candlelit halls. They do not imagine the smell, but the smell was everywhere. The garderobes, the castle toilets, were narrow chambers built into the thickness of the walls, with a wooden bench and a hole dropping straight down into the moat or a pit below. No pipes, no sewers, no separation of waste and water. In summer, the stench drifted upward with the heat, clinging to the corridors, the stairwells, even the Lord's private chambers. Servants carried straw to scatter in the pits to keep the worst of it down, but the filth always found its way back. The moat itself, that famous line of defense surrounding so many castles, was often little better than an open sewer. Rain carried refuse from the kitchens, the stables, the courtyards, washing into the water below the walls. Dead animals were thrown in, sometimes even the bodies of those who had died in sieges when graves could not be dug quickly enough. The drawbridge clattered down over water thick with rot, the air buzzing with flies in the summer sun. And in that filth thrived rats. They scurried along the beams in the granaries, through the straw in the stables, under the rushes covering the floors of the great hall. People grew used to the sound of them scratching the walls at night, their bright eyes flashing in torchlight before they vanished into the shadows. No one knew that the fleas on their backs carried the deadliest plague in human history. When the Black Death came in 1347, it spread along trade routes through towns and villages, but found no shortage of victims inside castle walls. The people had believed the walls would save them, that the disease belonged to the poor in the streets, the beggars by the roadsides. But the rats were already within the gates, feasting on the same grain as the Lord's own horses, running along the same rafters above the heads of sleeping servants. One by one, the fever struck, the coughing began. Black swellings rose beneath the arms, at the neck, in the groin. The priests muttered prayers. The physicians bled the sick with knives, burned herbs, carried charms against bad air. None of it worked. Chronicles tell of castles where so many died so quickly that bodies were dragged to walls and heaved into moat below, because there was no time, no strength left to bury them. The enemy outside did not need to lift a sword. Death was already inside the gates, carried by creatures no one even noticed. And yet disease was not the only silent killer. There was the smoke. Medieval castles had fires in almost every room, hearths in the great hall, braziers in the chambers, torches in corridors. But chimneys were rare in early centuries. The smoke gathered under the rafters, rolling down stairways, curling through doorways, burning the eyes, the throat, the lungs. Children grew up breathing it from birth. Visitors wrote of entering halls so thick with smoke they could barely see the people on the other side. Servants coughed as they carried platters of meat through the haze. Lords held court with their eyes streaming, their voices echoing off walls blackened with soot. It settled into the rushes on the floors, into the hangings on the walls, into the very clothes people wore until the smell clung to them wherever they went. The lungs of those who lived their lives in castles filled slowly with the damage, year after year, until the coughing never stopped, until breath came short even in youth. And then there was the fire itself. Stone walls could not burn, but everything inside them could. The roofs were timber. The floors were timber. The galleries, the doors, the staircases, the furniture, all timber. The rushes on the floor were dry as tinder in summer. The tapestries covering the walls, to keep out the cold, could burst into flame in a heartbeat. One spark falling where it should not. One torch knocked from its sconce. One gust of wind to the wrong doorway. And fire raced upward to the wooden stairs, across the rust-strewn floors, along the galleries where people ran, choking and blinded toward doors already cut off by flame. Chronicles tell of servants leaping from windows as the great hall burned behind them, of noble women carried down smoke-filled stairways by soldiers while children screamed in the dark. At Cousy Castle, fire took the kitchens first. The wind carried sparks to the hall where the tapestries caught, and by the time the bells rang from the chapel tower, the roofs were already roaring like a storm. At Hedingham, sparks from the hearth in midwinter leapt to the stables. Horses kicked down doors in terror as men tried to cut their halters, the night full of screams and smoke, while snow fell silently on the walls above. The same fires that kept you alive in winter might kill you before dawn. And medical knowledge was so thin, so riddled with superstition, that even the smallest injury from such disasters could turn fatal. A cut hand might fester until fever set in. A broken bone might never heal straight, leaving a man crippled for life if it didn't kill him with infection first. For there were no antibiotics, no real surgeries, only poultices of herbs, prayers to saints, charms against the evil eye, the muttered Latin of physicians who learned more from astrology than anatomy. Every accident carried the weight of death. Every sickness might be the last. Life inside a castle was not the life of fairy tales. It was a gamble against danger seen and unseen, against the rats in the dark, the smoke in the halls, the sparks drifting upward from a hearth. The walls protected you from swords and arrows, yes, but from the things already inside, the filth, the fire, the silent killers waiting in the rushes under your feet. Those walls offered no protection at all. And yet, the danger of filth in medieval castles was not only physical. It crept into the mind as much as the body. Imagine it. You wake before dawn in the freezing dark. The rushes on the floor beneath you are damp because last night someone spilled ale, or perhaps worse. Mice scurry over your pallet, looking for crumbs. Somewhere above, water drips from the roof beams where melting snow has found its way in. The air smells of smoke, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the moat just beyond the walls. Breakfast will be whatever the servants bring. Bread hard as wood, cheese gone sharp at the edges, maybe pottage bubbling over a smoky hearth. No one speaks of the rats. No one even bothers to shoo them away from the grain bins anymore. They belong here as much as the people do. In summer, the smell rises like a living thing. The garderobes empty straight down the walls into the moat. People throw garbage there too. Broken pots, kitchen scraps, dead chickens. Anything not worth keeping. Rain turns it to sludge. When the wind shifts, it carries the stink to the narrow windows, through the arrow slits, through every crack in the stone. Visitors from other lands often wrote of it with disgust. One Italian merchant in the 15th century complained that English castles reeked of beasts and men alike, so that the air clung to the clothing even after leaving. He described the halls as smoky caves, the courtyards ankle-deep in filth after rain, the water from the wells tasting faintly of dung no matter how deep they dug. And the people living there? They knew no different. Bathing was rare. Fires were hard to keep lit in winter, and heating enough water to fill a tub was a luxury reserved for lords and ladies, maybe once a month. Servants rinsed their faces in cold basins, scrubbed their hands when the work was done, but a full bath? That was for feast days or holy days, if at all. The church sometimes even warned against too much bathing. They said it encouraged vanity, temptation, sin. Cleanliness was for the soul, not the skin, and so the dirt stayed. It lived under fingernails, in hair, in the seams of clothing that might be washed only a few times a year. Lice were constant companions. Chronicles speak of noble ladies sitting by the fire, picking through each other's hair for nits, while servants deloused the bedding with irons heated in the flames. Even the great lords, armored in silk and velvet, scratching under their collars as fleas and lice feasted unseen. And those fleas carried death. The chronicles never mentioned the rats much. People thought little of them. They were as common as shadows, part of the world like sparrows or flies. But the fleas, they leapt from rat to man, from man to child, from child to bedding, and when the Black Death came, they carried it everywhere. In 1348, the Earl of Warwick shut himself inside his castle when the plague reached England. He posted guards at the gates, turned away travelers, held prayers in the chapel every morning. He thought the walls would save him. By autumn, he was dead. So were his wife, his children, half his household. The rats had been inside the whole time, running along the beams above the great hall, while the family prayed below. The plague killed quickly, but other diseases lingered like wolves in the dark. Dysentery spread when the wells grew foul. Typhoid followed the flies from the latrines to the kitchens. A single servant falling sick might carry it to the Lord's table by nightfall, and there was no cure. Physicians bled the sick with knives, drained cups of blood into bowls while the patient fainted from weakness. They burned herbs like rosemary and sage to drive away bad air. They carried charms, wore rings of coral or amulets filled with scripture. None of it mattered. Children died before their 5th birthdays more often than not. Mothers did not name their babies until they survived the first year, because so many did not. Inside the castle walls, people prayed for protection, from God, from saints, from any power that might hear them ode coughing in the dark. But the walls trapped more than prayers. They trapped smoke. In winter, every hearth roared. Fires burned in the kitchens, the halls, the guardrooms, the chambers. Torches guttered in the corridors. Candles smoked in the chapels. Braziers glowed red in the corners. And all of it breathed out thick, choking smoke into rooms with no chimneys, no real ventilation at all. Visitors wrote of entering halls so blackened by soot they looked like caves. The rafters dripped tar where the smoke had thickened over years into greasy layers. Children played on floors strewn with rushes, while above them the air swirled blue with haze, their lungs filling with it day after day until coughing became as common as speech. The people thought little of it. The smoke was part of life, like the cold, like the dirt, like the rats. But modern doctors reading the chronicles see something else. Lungs scarred before adulthood, eyes inflamed, throats raw, lives shortened by air thick enough to choke a torch flame if the wind died in the wrong corridor. And then sometimes the fire itself escaped. One torch knocked from its bracket, one spark leaping from a spit in the kitchens, one gust through the tapestries where a candle burned too close. And the same fire that gave life in winter turned killer in moments. At least one castle in France burned every decade between the 12th and 15th centuries. Chronicles tell of kitchens exploding into flame when boiling tallow spilled into hearth fires, of roofs catching during summer feasts when torches blazed too near the beams. People ran choking through corridors that turned into chimneys, the stairwells drawing flames upward so fast that sometimes those below survived, while those above never reached the doorways before the smoke took them. Wooden stairs collapsed under running feet. Roofs fell inward with roaring thunder. The walls held the fire inside like a kiln, the heat so fierce it cracked stone before the night was done. And when the fire passed, when the ashes cooled, when the bodies were dragged out into the courtyards for burial, people rebuilt, with more wood, more tapestries, more rushes on the floor, because there was no other way. And always, even after fire or plague or hunger, came the injuries. A cut hand from a kitchen knife might swell black by morning. A fall from a ladder might break ribs that pierced lungs before the physician even arrived with his leeches and prayers. They had no real surgeries, no real cures. A toothache might turn to infection. Infection might turn to fever. Fever might turn to death before the week was out. And so life inside the walls was a bargain with danger itself. Danger in the air, in the water, in the food, in the bedding, in the very stones that trapped you through winter storms and summer sieges alike. The walls kept the enemy out, but sometimes the enemy had been inside all along. The banners appear on the hills at dawn. At first, they are just colored scraps in the distance, too far to see clearly. Then the glint of metal in the morning sun, the flash of spear points as the enemy army wheels into position. Inside the castle, bells ring. Messengers run through the courtyards, shouting for gates to be barred, for walls to be manned, for the lore to be told at once. The drawbridge thunders upward. The great doors close with a boom that echoes through the corridors. The siege has begun. At first, spirits are high. The Lord stands on the walls with his captains, watching the enemy encampments rise in the fields below. Tents go up. Fires are lit. Men and horses gather like storm clouds. The defenders shout insults down at them. Crossbowmen loose a few bolts just to show the walls are ready. Inside, servants hurry to the granaries and the wells. Barrels of water are rolled into cellars. Sacks of grain are carried up from the storehouses. Chickens are slaughtered. Cows and sheep are driven into the courtyards, where the grass will last only days before it turns to mud. The gates stay shut, and slowly the waiting begins. At first, life continues almost normally. Meals are smaller, but there is bread, there is meat, there is ale. Children still play in the corners of the great hall, while soldiers sharpen swords by the hearth. The chaplain rings the bells at dawn and dusk, but the air grows close as days pass. The enemy sends arrows over the walls sometimes, but most of the time they just sit out there, waiting, watching. The wells begin to fail first. A single dead animal dumped into a well at night by enemy scouts can poison the water for everyone inside. Chronicles tell of rotting corpses flung over walls from catapults. Disease as a weapon centuries before germ theory ever existed. One body in the courtyard could start a sickness that ran through the barracks in a week. And the food shrinks next. At Harlech Castle in Wales, defenders during the siege of 1461 held out for years, eating first the livestock, then the dogs, then rats caught in the corners of the granaries. The chronicles grow thin on details after that, as if the scribes themselves hesitated to write what came next. At Kenilworth in 1266, after 6 long months, they surrendered at last. Survivors stumbled out gaunt and hollow-eyed, too weak to lift their arms when the victors marched them away in chains. The walls keep the enemy out, yes, but they also keep everything else in. The hunger, the thirst, the stink of hundreds of bodies crowded into halls and towers while the food rots, while the air itself turns foul. By week 4, the children cry constantly. By week 6, the mothers stop crying at all. And always, outside the walls, the enemy waits. Sometimes they play drums at night to keep the defenders from sleeping. Sometimes they leave the bodies of the dead where the defenders can see them, swelling in the sun until the air shifts the wrong way and carries the stench through the arrow slits. Sometimes they do nothing at all, knowing the silence works better than any weapon. Inside, tempers flare. Servants accuse soldiers of stealing bread. Soldiers accuse the Lord's steward of hoarding grain for the Lord's table. People vanish into cellars with knives when they think no one sees. When the enemy shouts promises of mercy over the walls, if someone will only open the gates at night, some listen. More than one castle fell because a single guard decided that silver and survival mattered more than loyalty. The chronicles tell betrayals in the dark, a postern gate left unbarred, a rope lowered from the walls, a sentry who looked the other way while enemy boots crossed the bridge before dawn. And when the enemy finally came in by storm or by treachery, mercy was rare. At Béziers in 1209, the Crusaders gave no quarter. Kill them all, the abbot said. God will know his own. When the gates fell, soldiers moved through the streets like wildfire. Women, children, priests at their altars. It made no difference. The chronicles say the blood ran ankle-deep in the church itself before the night was done. Other times, the defenders were spared, but only after watching their homes burned, their food stores taken, their walls torn down stone by stone, so the castle would never rise again. Even surrender did not always mean survival, and all the while, disease crept through the ranks like another enemy. Too many people crammed into too little space, too little food, too little clean water. The moat turned black with waste. The wells stank of rot. One man falls sick, then 3, then 10. Soon the priest is ringing the bells every morning over another body carried to the courtyard for burial in shallow, hurried graves. The enemy outside doesn't need to fire a single arrow. The castle kills itself from the inside. The psychological weight grew heavier than the hunger. Nights filled with the sound of drums beyond the walls. Or worse, with silence when the soldiers outside wanted the defenders to wonder what they were planning. Children woke screaming from nightmares of giants at the gates, of monsters climbing the walls. Women whispered prayers to saints no one had prayed to in decades, bargaining for bread, for rain, for anything. And men stared at the gates in the dark, wondering if opening them was worse than dying behind them, because sometimes the waiting killed faster than the swords. Winter sieges were the worst. No fresh food, no firewood after the first month. People burned furniture, doors, roof beams to keep warm while snow piled against the walls outside. Chronicles speak of castles where the garrison huddled in one room at night, because the rest stood empty, too cold to survive until morning. When spring finally came, sometimes the defenders crawled out too weak to fight, too thin to stand, their lord carried on a litter because he could no longer walk. The enemy barely needed to lift a blade, and yet sieges lasted months, sometimes years. At Chateau Gallard in 1204, the defenders ate horseflesh in the last weeks before the walls fell. Children starved in cellars, while King John of England promised relief that never came. At Montségur in 1244, the defenders held out for 9 long months before surrendering to the Crusaders. Over 200 were burned alive afterward for heresy when they refused to renounce their faith. The walls that promised safety delivered only smoke and screams in the end. Because a castle under siege was not a fortress. It was a prison. The gates locked. The air turned foul. The food ran out. The wells went bad. The enemy waited. And the people inside learned that stone walls can keep armies out, yes, but they can also keep death in. By the 3rd month of siege, even the strongest men begin to break. The noise from the enemy outside never stops entirely. Sometimes it is drums in the night. Sometimes laughter drifting faintly from their fires as they feast on meat and bread the defenders can smell but not taste. Other times it is the sudden scream of a wounded man on the walls after an arrow finds its mark, followed by the slow, endless groaning as he dies because no one dares climb up under fire to pull him down. The enemy knows what they are doing. Sieges are not only fought with stone and steel, they are fought inside the minds of the trapped. At Stirling in 1304, Edward I of England brought war machines, so Hughes the Chronicles gave them names. Warwolf, the Great Trebuchet, flung stones heavier than a man's body at the walls day and night until the defenders inside lived with the sound of crashing stone like thunder over their heads. At Rouen in 1418, the English sat outside the walls for 6 long months. The city held thousands. The Chronicles speak of hunger so fierce that when all the dogs and cats had been eaten, the people turned to leather, old saddles, belts, the hides of oxen boiled until they were soft enough to chew. Children starved in the streets. When at last the city surrendered, whole families were too weak to walk. The castle itself never moved, never fell, but the people within it withered like candles burning down to stubs. Inside the walls, quarrels turn to hatred. The Lord keeps the best food for his table, while soldiers grow gaunt in the barracks. Servants whisper that grain stores look smaller each week, though the steward swears they are not. Guards mutter that the men-at-arms drink too much of the ale, while the archers go thirsty. One stolen loaf of bread can start a fight that ends in blood before the hearth. At Rochester Castle in 1215, when King John's men dug beneath the walls and set fire to props holding up the tunnels, the walls collapsed, but the defenders inside had already been weeks at the edge of starvation. Chronicles say the king's men offered surrender terms before the final assault because they knew the garrison was too weak to fight anyway. Sometimes the defenders tried tricks of their own. Dead animals flung back over the walls to spread disease among the besiegers. Boiling water, sometimes even boiling pitch, poured from the battlements onto men carrying ladders. Stones rolled down murder holes when the enemy tried the gates. But these are the efforts of desperation. The enemy outside only needs time. Time and hunger and fear. And fear grows quickly inside walls where no one leaves. You hear the same voices every day, the same footsteps on the stairs, the same coughing in the night, the same prayers whispered in the chapel while the bells toll for the dead again and again until even the priest sounds weary. Rumors grow like weeds in the dark. The enemy will storm the walls tomorrow. The Lord will surrender by nightfall. The wells are poisoned. The baker is hoarding flour. The guard at the West Tower takes bribes from men beyond the walls. Maybe the enemy has dug tunnels beneath the towers. Maybe they will come up through the floor any day now. And sometimes it is true. At Chateau Gallard, King Philip's men of France tunneled beneath the walls while defenders starved above. One night, they broke through into the chapel itself. The chronicles say the soldiers burst in during prayers, swords flashing among women and children who had taken shelter there, the floor running red before the garrison even knew the enemy was inside the walls. A castle under siege was never safe, not even from its own stones. Winter makes it worse. Snow cuts off what little firewood remains. Soldiers huddle together in one room at night because the rest stand too cold, too dark, too empty to survive until morning. Wind howls through the arrow slits like the voices of the dead. At Harlech Castle, during the siege of 1468, the men inside watched 7 winters come and go before they surrendered at last. 7 years behind walls turning black with smoke, gray with hunger, silent with a cough of sickness that never left them. Imagine that. 7 years without leaving the gates. 7 years of the same walls, the same faces, the same fear every morning that this would be the day the enemy came over the walls, or through the gates, or up from tunnels dug beneath the floor where you sleep. And always there is the knowledge of what will happen if the walls fall. Everyone knows. At Béziers, the Crusaders gave no quarter. At Acre in 1291, when the city fell to the Mamluks, survivors were chained and marched into slavery, while the streets ran red behind them. Sometimes the besiegers promised mercy. Sometimes they even kept the promise. But often they did not, because men who had waited months in mud and rain outside walls grew hard and angry. They had buried comrades killed by arrows shot from those battlements. They had watched the defenders mock them from the towers, while food ran low in their own camp. When the gates fell at last, they came through like a tide of fire. The chronicles tell of betrayals too. Hungry men on the walls listening to promises shouted from the dark. Open the gate and you will live. Open the gate and we will spare your family. Open the gate and you will have silver enough to buy land of your own when this is done. And sometimes someone listens. At night, a postern gate left unbarred, a rope lower from the walls, a sentry who looks the other way while shapes move through the shadows below the towers. And in the morning, the enemy is in the courtyard before the garrison even knows the walls have been lost. The siege turns the castle itself against its people. The wells run dry. The granaries grow empty. The air grows foul. The walls that once promised safety become cold gray cliffs, holding you inside, while death waits at the gates, or in the water, or in the coffin of the man on the pallet beside you. You begin to understand that the enemy outside does not need to kill you. The walls will do it for them. And when at last the gates fall, by hunger, by sickness, by treachery, by fire, there is no strength left to fight. The survivors stumble out thin as shadows, eyes sunken, faces gray, the dead left unburied behind them, because no one has the strength to carry them anymore. Sometimes the victors kill them where they stand. Sometimes they spare them for ransom or slavery. But the castle is broken. The walls that held so long now stand silent over empty courtyards where only crows move among the ashes. And the wind whistles through arrow slits above rooms where children once cried and soldiers once sharpened swords, where hunger and fear whisper for months before the end came at last. Because a siege does not just break walls. It breaks the people inside them, body and mind, food and faith, until the proud fortress that once promised safety becomes only a tomb of stone and silence. When you stand before a medieval castle today, rising from its hilltop like something carved out of legend, it feels almost eternal. The towers reach toward the sky, banners once snapped proudly in the wind, and stone walls stand where kings and knights once walked. But the story those stones tell is not the story we think we know. For centuries, artists, poets, and filmmakers have painted castles in the colors of romance. Gallant knights clashing sword beneath moonlit walls, queens in velvet gowns smiling from balconies, kings holding feasts in glittering halls. Children read fairy tales where castles are homes of magic, courage, and chivalry. Yet behind the thick gray walls, life was far from enchanted. The reality was colder, dirtier, crueler, and often deadlier. Imagine you're not a king or queen, but a servant, rising before dawn on a winter morning inside those mighty walls. The fire in the great hall burned low in the night. The ashes still glow faintly, but the rest of the castle is freezing. Your breath fogs before your face as you hurry through drafty corridors, carrying buckets of water drawn from a half-frozen well. The wooden stairs are slick with frost, and more than one servant has slipped and broken a limb before breakfast. You pass the stables, where horses stamp and snort in the bitter air. Somewhere above you, soldiers curse as they haul up sacks of grain from the courtyard, their hands raw and red from the cold. No one thinks of castles as cold now, but in winter, the chill sank into everything, stone, straw, bone. A noble family might have fur cloaks, roaring fires, thick woolen hangings on the walls, but still the wind found its way through cracks in the shutters, down chimneys, through the very stones themselves. At night, people slept in layers of wool and linen, huddling together for warmth. The myth of kings and queens in silken nightclothes is just that, a myth. In truth, even royalty shivered under blankets stiff with cold by morning, and the cold was only one enemy. Disease haunted these castles like a shadow no sword could kill. Cholera and dysentery crept in through water supplies foul by waste. Fever spread silently through halls where too many people slept too close together. Servants whispered prayers as the priests moved from room to room, muttering blessings over the coughing, the pale, the dying. Even the nobles, with their feather beds and silver cups, lived one sickness away from ruin. A winter fever could empty a nursery in a week. The chronicles speak of lords burying sons and daughters with the same weary resignation as peasants in the villages below. For all the armor and walls and armies, a single rat carrying fleas could kill faster than any invading army. And the danger did not sleep when spring returned. In summer, the stench of waste pits, stables, and unwashed bodies thickened in the heat until the very air felt rotten. Flies gathered on everything. Food spoiled quickly. Wells turned foul again when rains washed filth into the water supply. The nobles held banquets in high halls, while servants chased rats from the kitchens below. Knights boasted of valor, while fleas crawled beneath the benches. Minstrels sang of love, while someone outside the walls buried another child dead of fever. The castle might have stood for power, but its walls could not keep out death. Even peace brought peril. Roofs caught fire from unattended hearts. Towers collapsed after storms. Gatehouses fell on their own men when rotting beams gave way. Horses kicked. Hunting accidents spilled noble blood as easily as war did. And always, the threat of betrayal lingered. A servant paid to poison a cup. A guard bribed to leave a postern gate unbarred. A friend turned enemy overnight when the balance of power shifted. The same walls that promised protection could become a trap before dawn. We imagine kings ruling with certainty, queens smiling beside them, knights defending honor on horseback beneath fluttering banners. But real chronicles tell of kings hiding in remote towers while rebels closed in, of queens fleeing burning castles in the night, of knights captured, ransomed, or left to rot in dungeons when fortunes turned. One moment, a man was lord of the castle. The next, he was a fugitive running through the woods while his own banner burned above the walls he once commanded. The line between ruler and exile, victor and corpse, was far thinner than legends admit. And for the ordinary people, the servants, the cooks, the smiths, the shepherds driven inside during raids, life behind castle walls was hard in ways no ballad sings about. They rose before the sun, worked until their backs ached, slept on straw, caught illnesses from the same rats and fleas that tormented the kitchens. They fetched water, hauled firewood, buried the dead, and shivered through the same winters as their lords. When famine came, they starved first. When plague came, they died first. When sieges came, they suffered most. The castle might have been built for kings, but its misery fell hardest on those whose names history never wrote down. So why do we still think of castles as romantic? because time scrubs away the dirt, the smoke, the screams. Stone walls endure while memories fade. Centuries later, we see only ruins against the sky, ivy curling around broken towers, sunlight falling gently where once fire-consumed wooden roofs. Pain does not last in stone. Only the shape of the walls remains, silent and empty, while the lives inside vanish like breath in winter air. But if you stood there then, inside those walls when they were full of people, you would smell smoke and unwashed bodies. You would hear coughing in the night, weeping in the chapel, shouting in the guardroom, the ring of blacksmiths mending gates before the next raid. You would feel the cold in your bones. You would taste the bitterness of bread stretched thin through famine months. You would see fear in every face each time a messenger arrived with news of war, rebellion, or plague moving closer. The castle was not a fairy tale. It was survival written in stone. Today, tourists take photographs where men once died on the walls. Children laugh where children once starved during sieges. Couples pose for wedding portraits where traitors once swung from gallows. Time turns everything gentle in the end. But the people who lived there did not live gentle lives. They lived with hunger, fear, sickness, cold, fire, betrayal, and death pressed close around them, inside walls that promised safety yet delivered danger day after day. The castle was never the dream we imagine. It was a stone trap waiting for its next victim. And so, next time you see a castle rising proudly above a hill, do not picture only kings in crowns and ladies in silk. Picture the smoke, the sickness, the hunger. Picture the fear behind barred gates at midnight. Picture the servants carrying water up frozen stairs, the soldiers coughing the barracks, the children buried before spring thawed the ground. Remember that the same walls that kept enemies out kept misery in. If you found this darker side of history fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us again here on Boring History Nights, where the past whispers its secrets, one story at a time. Historians often speak of castles as symbols of power, and yes, they were power made stone. They stood as threats to enemies, as promises to subjects, as warnings to anyone who thought to rebel. But the people living inside them, lords, ladies, soldiers, servants, knew another truth. The walls cut them off from the world outside, but they also cut them off from comfort. Take the great halls. For instance, when visitors picture a medieval castle, they imagine roaring fires, tables heavy with meat and bread, music echoing from rafters while courtiers laugh in candlelight. But stand in one of those halls today, even restored, even with the sun shining through windows added centuries later, and you will feel how cold they are. Now imagine them with no glass and windows, only wooden shutters against the wind. Imagine the smoke from 100 tallow candles mixing with the smoke of the fire pit, because chimneys had not yet been invented. Imagine the floor covered in rushes changed only a few times a year, crawling with insects. The people who lived there did not speak of romance. They spoke of drafts that made candles flicker sideways, of fires that smoked instead of warming, of walls sweating with damp in spring rains, of the cough that never quite left the children after winter. We talk about kings and queens as though they lived apart from suffering, above it, untouchable. But in 1316, even Edward II of England feared famine as the great European hunger spread across the land. Crops failed. Grain rotted in the fields after endless rain. Entire villages starved. Chroniclers wrote of parents abandoning children, of corpses left by roadsides because no one had the strength to bury them. And in the castles, the lords had more food stored, yes. They could last longer behind their walls. But when the countryside emptied, when no carts came to the gates, even castles grew quiet with hunger. Servants slipped away in the night, searching for scraps. Horses vanished from stables, slaughtered in secret before the Lord finally gave permission to kill them openly. By spring, even the noble tables held thin soups and coarse bread. Hunger did not care about titles, nor did fear. The chronicles speak often of sieges, but less often of the endless rumors that haunted castles even in times of peace. The neighboring lord raises troops. The king's favor shifts. A cousin claims the land belongs to him. The steward pockets too much coin. The guard drinks too much on his watch. And always the whisper, someone inside these walls may betray them. Servants listened at doors. Messengers carried more than letters. A baron at supper with his household might laugh at a joke, while wondering if the man across the table would turn against him tomorrow. Because when power changed hands, it changed fast. One week a man was lord of his castle, with banners flying from towers. The next, he knelt in the mud before his conqueror, while his family fled through postern gates at midnight. And then there was fire. People forget how much of every castle was wood. Floors, roofs, doors, beams. One careless spark, and the same flames that cooked the Lord's Supper could devour entire wings before buckets arrived from the well. In 1298, Edinburgh Castle burned so fiercely the garrison abandoned it to the English without a fight. Chronicles tell of prisoners roasted alive in tower dungeons because no one reached them in time. Fire killed fast. Smoke killed slowly. Most castles lacked proper chimneys until the later Middle Ages. Fires in the Great Hall sent smoke drifting upward, blackening rafters, stinging eyes, thickening lungs year after year. Servants coughed through winters. Children wheezed through summers. And men grew old before their time, breathing walls darkened by centuries of smoke. The enemy outside might never come, but the air itself betrayed you. And yet, castles kept rising across Europe, because kings needed to show power, because lords needed walls when kings turned on them, because bandits needed frightening, because peasants needed reminding who ruled them. So stone by stone they rose, across England, France, Germany, Spain, Scotland, Ireland, each one promising safety, wealth, order. Each one hiding the same cold rooms, smoky halls, foul wells, and restless nights. Visitors today admire the architecture. The spiral stairs climbing towers clockwise so attacking swordsmen, right-handed, fought uphill at a disadvantage. The murder holes above gateways for dropping stones or boiling water on enemies below. The narrow arrow slits that let archers shoot while staying safe inside. But living among these defenses meant living among constant reminders of danger. Every stair built for killing. Every gate ready to be sealed for siege. Every wall whispering that enemies might come at any moment. Even peace felt temporary. And sometimes, the enemy was not outside at all. Servants stole food. Guards stabbed each other in drunken brawls. Stewards cheated lords of taxes. Cooks poisoned rivals for a higher place in the kitchens. Chroniclers tell of murders in halls during feasts, of brothers killing brothers over inheritance, of guards opening gates to midnight assassins. Stone walls kept out armies. They did not keep out greed, rage, or ambition. And over all of it hung death. Not the glorious death of knights in shining armor sung by poets, but the slow death of winter fevers, the silent death of infants in cold nurseries, the choking death of smoke-filled rooms, the gnawing death of famine when grain stores emptied, the screaming death of servants burned in sudden fires, the forgotten death of peasants buried outside chapel walls because plague left no time for proper graves. Centuries later, when castles fell silent, people forgot. Grass covered the courtyards. Roofs collapsed. Birdsong replaced the clang of hammers. The cries of the hungry. The coughing in smoky halls. Ruins looked peaceful. But those walls remember. They remember winters when wind screamed through arrow slits. Sieges when men tore flesh from horses' bones before surrender. Fires that lit the sky red for miles. Plagues that left halls silent but for the priest's prayers. If stone could speak, castles would not tell fairy tales. They would tell stories to chill the blood. And so, when you stand before one today, do not picture only kings and crowns. Picture the smoke. Picture the hunger. Picture the fear in every face each time hoofbeats sounded at the gates after dark. Remember that for all their power, castles were never gentle places. They were cold, dangerous, and often deadly. Stone did not protect life as much as it imprisoned it. Next time you look up at those towering walls, think of the people who lived and died inside them. Not just the lords and ladies, but the servants climbing icy stairs before dawn, the soldiers coughing through winters, the children buried after sieges. Because the castle was not only a fortress, it was a world of suffering sealed behind stone, a death trap disguised as safety. As the last echoes of history fade, we're left standing in the empty courtyards of castles that once ruled the world. Their walls rise silent now, blackened by centuries of smoke, scarred by wars long forgotten, towering over fields where no banners fly. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the footsteps of servants trudging through snow with buckets of water before dawn, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing off stone walls as soldiers sharpened swords for battles that never came, the laughter at noble feasts covering the whispers of rebellion brewing in dark corners, and beneath it all, the coughing of the sick, the cries of the hungry, the silence of the dead carried out through postern gates at night. Because these castles were never just fortresses of power. They were places of fear, of cold, of betrayal, of death waiting patiently through winters, sieges, fires, and plagues. Stone walls could not keep it out, and in the end, those walls outlived everyone who once thought them safe. Kings fell, queens vanished, soldiers died, servants were buried in unmarked graves outside the chapel walls. But the castles remain empty, broken, staring down at us across centuries like giant tombstones for lives lost inside. As the last echoes of history fade, we're left standing in the empty courtyards of castles that once ruled the world. Their walls rise silent now, blackened by centuries of smoke, scarred by wars long forgotten, towering over fields where no banners fly. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear them, the footsteps of servants trudging through snow with buckets of water before dawn, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing off stone walls as soldiers sharpened swords for battles that never came, the laughter at noble feasts covering the whispers of rebellion brewing in dark corners, and beneath it all, the coughing of the sick, the cries of the hungry, the silence of the dead carried out through postern gates at night. Because these castles were never just fortresses of power. They were places of fear, of cold, of betrayal, of death waiting patiently through winters, sieges, fires, and plagues. Stone walls could not keep it out, and in the end, those walls outlived everyone who once thought them safe. Kings fell, queens vanished, soldiers died, servants were buried in unmarked graves outside the chapel walls. But the castles remain empty, broken, staring down at us across centuries like giant tombstones for lives lost inside. So next time you see one rising proudly above the hills, remember this. For the people who lived there, it wasn't romance. It wasn't fairy tales. It wasn't safety. It was survival. It was fear. It was a death trap made of stone. And if you want more history secrets, stripped of myths told slowly, told darkly, stay with us here on Boring History for Sleep. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and return again as we walk through the shadows of the past, one story at a time.